thanks for being interested in the Web IDE project and wanting to be a maintainer and code reviewer. I think it's a really neat project and it's a lot of fun to work on. But it could definitely use some more people interested in doing code review because right now it's just our team and one of them's on a very long paternity leave. And so we're running out of heads. But it's also really fun and exciting technology. So I think hopefully there's a win-win here. But the way we're gonna accelerate onboarding onto this project is today I'm gonna do a very broad brush stroke of all of the moving pieces with this project. In no way is it expected that you need to memorize everything about the project or be intimately familiar with it. Just being sort of familiar with the thing is the objective, and having some of the keywords in your head. The next three sessions is we'll pair on something, and it will be interesting because we'll be in doing separate time zone meetings, and we'll see how that works out. But so this is just the big introduction time, and not what the remainder of the meetings will be like. Um, okay, let me start sharing my screen. And so I took some notes. I started out trying to make a slide, and then man, that just took too long. So I was like, all right, I'm just making notes. Because it's like I was trying to make it pretty. And I was like, why am I wasting my time making this pretty? I'm just gonna take notes. Um, so when we jump into the GitLab Web IDE project, um, which lives here under the GitLab org, uh, there's a couple other projects before we jump into this one that we should probably be familiar with. Um, Before I do that, is everyone familiar with the Web IDE? Uh, that
And
is that's this button right here. Uh, you click it, it opens up this VS Code browser environment where I can start making changes right from inside GitLab, and I can make changes and jump into source control and review my changes and start committing things. Super neat and exciting. So the most recent exciting thing has happened to this feature is what's before your eyes is that this is now all in VS Code. Um, Previously, we had a homegrown environment that was a little unreliable because it was homegrown, and VS Code has loads of love and a robust community um, that keeps it very lovable. So it's been pretty great that we were able to find a way to make it seamlessly connect with your GitLab context. Um, And so previously where we had a full from scratch editing environment based on the Monaco editor and we controlled all the moving pieces. Now the project is a lot smaller because VS Code does a lot of the heavy lifting, but there's some more interesting bits to make VS Code fit in. So that's where these satellite projects are going to come in. So before we jump into GitLab Web IDE, there's two other projects to be just aware of. There's the GitLab VS Code extension project, which is our official GitLab VS Code extension that you can get from the VS Code marketplace and has a whole bunch of features, like a crazy amount of features of integrating your editing environment into VS Code. Like you can review a merge request from within VS Code. Um, Loads of really cool stuff. And this was one of the um, big visions with moving our Web IDE from our homegrown solution to VS Code is like, man, if we can get then the VS Code extension working in the Web IDE, we have out of the box a really neat set of features that people could become more effective just all from in the browser. So there's an ongoing effort to decouple a lot of the features that are coupled to a desktop environment to being a little bit more polymorphic, where they're aware of this Web IDE environment. They can fit into the Web IDE browser environment and the desktop environment. So right now we do have a browser build of the VS Code extension that gets put into the GitLab Web IDE. but there's only a small subset of features that are included there that are actually browser compatible. Where this comes in, since we're really just looking at being reviewers for this project, is if there's like a new feature we're building that we want to live in both, the desktop environment and the web ID, then we probably want that feature to live here. And the only change that really needs to happen in GitLab Web IDE is just updating our version reference of the VS Code extension. That's about all that we kind of need to know about this. So right now, and that there's just an ongoing effort of we're trying to move more and more features that are just desktop specific, and so into being compatible on both ends. But we don't have to dive into that too much. The other satellite project to be aware of is there's a GitLab Web IDE VS Code fork. And the first thing I have to say about this is that this is just a necessary evil. And the goal is don't touch this thing, because we forked VS Code and we've made some very thoughtful surgical changes to it. And we don't want to make too many changes because we want to be able to stay up to date with the upstream VS Code. And the more we deviate from the main line, then when things change, we'll run into conflicts, and that will be difficult to maintain. The downside is we've kind of touched this thing a bit, but we really try not to. There's a lot more that we want to try to do to control how we do this. A lot of us touching this project is just affecting how we build it. So a lot of there's like some CI changes and internal scripts with it. But this is this artifact that the project produces is a tarball of the VS Code browser environment. And that's what we also load into the GitLab Web IDE. Not much that we regularly have to touch here, but if we ever update this, what you'll see in the main Web IDE project is you'll see just an update to the version location of, we've updated the VS Code fork version of where we're downloading it from. Yeah, those are the main other two projects that this Web IDE project communicates with. Yeah, and that brings us to the GitLab Web IDE, which the main artifacts that we produce from this project is this GitLab Web IDE npm package. And so this gets published through CI jobs, which we have a lot to do to make it more to improve the developer experience. So we're not making tagging releases ad hoc, and we're able to do this on a schedule. You also notice that we're not using semantic versioning yet. That's definitely on the to-do list. But yeah, the main output of the GitLab Web IDE project is this npm package. Yeah, I'm gonna pause because I could just keep going. Is there any questions or thoughts about things so far? Does the galaxy of projects make sense?
Do you have to keep the VS Code version in the fork up to date? How does that work?
Yes, the goal is to do that. And so we kind of try to do that as needed. And we've had to do that when there's like a security issue on something. And so but I've been blocked on it because the last time I tried to do it, there was a bug in the browser version. So I tried to find a way around it and contribute a upstream issue, and VS Code didn't seem to like my issue. So yeah, the fork we need to try to keep up to date too with the VS Code version. And the current way that we maintain this so that we separate our commits from their commits is we have like a documented process for this, but we're kind of looking at possibly changing this because it was kind of an experiment to see if this was a lovable developer experience, and so far I haven't felt the love for it. But we replay our commits onto like a release candidate branch that we we have the branch is based off of whatever VS Code forks, the VS Code tag we want to base it off of. And then we replay all our commits on top of that, which is kind of cool, but it does require us to force push to main when we finally commit to everything, which is not a pleasant experience. All of it to say, don't be surprised if you see that there's a lot of love to be had with all of these projects. And we're regularly interested in improving developer experience. We've tried to document our processes as much as possible. But with that said, one of the most important things that can be done, and I'm going to leave this comment in that the issue that I invited you all in, joining the VS Code Web IDE Slack channel is the best way to stay up to date for like what's changing. And I might ping the maintainers of the project as like, be up to date. We're changing the way things are done over here. And for the most part, you just have to be kind of aware of that's kind of going on. I'm sorry. I really that was a long-winded answer to your question. I could have just said yes. I'm sorry. Yeah, we want to keep it up to date. All right. Let's take a quick look at the repository, and I want to show a bit of how it's kind of laid out. So, all right, we have documents folder. This is where we try to document some of our processes and how to work with the different tools and patterns that you'll see in the project. So perusing through this and just being familiar with it, it would be nice. But we kind of use it as a reference. We have a submodule at the moment to GitLab VS Code extension because we were working on building the interop between these two. We need to be pretty lean with when we were building that. So using a submodule helped us move quick. But there's some downsides with the submodule here, which is if I'm like searching for something in the project-wide search in VS Code, it'll search in both the submodule and in the main thing. So the submodule approach to including the GitLab VS Code extension might not stay around, but that's how it gets included. And then you'll see all of the source code lives inside of this folder packages. So unlike the main GitLab project where we have all of our JavaScript lives in one folder and any module can reference another module and all of it becomes this big bowl of spaghetti because modules are pointing all over the place. We've tried to organize the responsibilities of to build that final GitLab Web IDE object into clear responsibilities, which are implemented with these packages. So for instance, there's a whole like file system package that we needed to implement that uses libraries like browserfs. Has nothing to do with VS Code, but just about implementing an in-memory file system we can keep track of with source control. So all of this lives in its own package so that it never breaks its encapsulation of just being concerned about file system stuff. It doesn't have to dive into VS Code specifics or GitLab client specifics. That would live in the GitLab client package. And then all of the VS Code specific stuff usually is prefixed with VS Code. So that's kind of the way that we've tried to use packages to create some boundaries with how the app is laid out. And then scripts is just like some development scripts. And then you have all of, the sundry of build and linting files that show up in every project. But the package is probably the most strangest thing to newcomers of the project. But if you've ever worked with a monorepo before or something like that, then it should feel somewhat at home. And the packages is an introduction into this document that I want to share, which lays out the architecture of what the packages do and what each package kind of produces a part of the Web IDE project. So before I dive into this, I do want to show. All right. It's probably telling when it's like anytime I move to a project, I don't have to ever stash my changes. I don't ever write anything or do anything I got to keep. I do so much I can just clear and remove. So the GitLab Web IDE package itself, this is what it ends up looking like is we have two folders. And so right now I'm inside of node modules in our main GitLab project. And I'm inside of the GitLab Web IDE or this at GitLab Web IDE. I want to show you the output of the package so that then we can get a feel of like, okay, these are the artifacts that's being consumed by main GitLab. And then where do they come from in the GitLab Web IDE project? But the strangest thing is that there's two parts to this package. There's one that gets imported in the JavaScript IDE page when we actually run import web IDE. So this kind of line, that's going to import the modules we see in, oh, I got to go find it again. Here we go. That's going to import the modules we see in lib. So it's like this index.js, that's importing this start. And what the start does is it's going to take an element and a whole bunch of configuration, and it builds an iframe that kicks off VS Code. VS Code kind of expects to have control over a whole frame. So it's just bootstraps VS Code with our Web IDE engine inside of it doing its thing. But where does it get all the VS Code assets? And because VS Code kind of expects a certain layout from how it's being served up. That's what this dist public directory is. So like this main, this is the entry point of that iframe that we kick off. But then you see like VS Code, this is VS Code runtime. And this comes straight from the VS Code fork, that satellite project. So the two parts of the package is there's the modules that get imported when we just by Webpack when we do import like this, but then there's the modules that are hosted. And so we have in our Webpack rules, don't bundle these, just host them as is. And so when we actually visit the Web IDE here, let's do it. When we actually visit the Web IDE here, we pull in all of our main Webpack chunks and stuff. Yes. And then all of these like just come from that dist public folder, just right into VS Code extensions. And like these are all VS Code stuff. And so these aren't bundled into the Webpack, they're just hosted. Does that make sense? Like there's a separation between what's bundled code and the hosted code.
Cool. Yeah, it makes sense.
Awesome. I'm not sure if it makes sense to me. That's why if I keep saying it, it's probably because I'm like, it still makes sense, right? Okay. Yeah, so that brings us to this document. So this big box shows the this big box shows a split between the lib index, which is that code that gets imported by Webpack, and then all the stuff that gets just hosted. So we have main.js, which is like our main entry point to that iframe we create. The VS Code Bootstrap package. Bootstrap is such a bad name, but that's what it's called. It bootstraps VS Code. And so this is the main entry point to the iframe that we create in the entry point package. And so all of like the VS Code entry point configuration parameters of like what's our social URL, what are the URLs that we need to look up our CDN assets from, a whole list of large amount of like product configuration information that VS Code lets you put at the entry point. All of that lives here. So anytime we're talking about injecting stuff at VS Code startup, that's kind of this package's responsibility. We try not to do, the goal is to lean into VS Code's extension API as much as possible. And so the heart of the Web IDE is probably implemented in this built-in GitLab Web IDE extension. So you can actually view, we don't have the extension marketplace enabled for security reasons at the moment. But you can view, like, VS Code comes baked in with a whole bunch of extensions, and we can provide our own built-in extensions. And so this Web IDE extension is like, this is the engine that loads the initial file tree view and keeps track of the source control, and all of the main behavior happens inside of this extension. And that's a package inside of the project. And so we'll dive into, we'll peruse that just a little bit, but for a lot of changes, they live inside of here of the extension API. But we see then, like, this bit includes bits like that file system package, because we're going to have a file system, and the GitLab API client, and so on. So this is a nice document for, the goal is to have packages that have a clear responsibility, and I kind of lay out, describe in words the package's responsibilities here, and so these responsibilities shouldn't really change. So as we make changes, we want to make sure we're not breaking the package encapsulation. I don't ever reference this diagram, so if it's confusing to you, that's fine, because it kind of still looks confusing to me. Okay, cool. Yeah, I wanted to show that, and then I think it'd be neat to just get a feel for what kind of MRs can come down the pipeline, and like see the kind of changes and the kind of packages that get touched. So there's a whole bunch of, so here's an example of where we just updated the VS Code extension reference because there was new feature development that we want to include. And so from the Web IDE project, all we did, since it's a submodule right now, is the submodule commit just had to be updated. And we have a CI job to make sure that this is actually released version of the VS Code extension project. So this is pretty straightforward. Probably as a reviewer, the main task is just doing a smoke test of making sure everything still works, which we will become very familiar with how to do in a little bit. I don't know. Let's see what other interesting ones. Document updates are not interesting. Well, I just have insulted a whole category of technical writers with that statement. And they are interesting, but they're not. We're gonna move on. This is a backport of a security fix. So we have documented like a security process if we need to do a security release. This has already been released, so this is why it's showing up in the main project now. Let's look at this one. So VS Code has built into it its own CDN that we want to use. We don't want to depend on anything outside of servers that we control. And so this is updating some of the configuration to point to a CDN we stood up. And so naturally, this required us updating the VS Code Bootstrap package, where we're putting all of our configuration that initializes how does VS Code start up at all. And so VS Code is a very, very robust configurable project. And so they have a lot of, there's loads and loads of configuration parameters that we can point different service URLs, because it's very flexible. And so we were able to point it to our own thing. It required a update. At the same time, there was a fork update that, because they did have some hard-coded references to their VS Code CDN that we wanted to also remove. So at the same time, we also updated this VS Code version, which is located in the VS Code build package. So if I go back to here in the GitLab Web IDE and packages. We've talked a bit about VS Code Bootstrap. VS Code Build is interesting because there's no source files here. The only thing that lives here is this. That's the only thing that lives here that's interesting is this JSON, which is just a pointer to where do we download the package, and then some metadata information about that package, and then a make file, which includes how does it become this? How does it become the folder in the dist directory? So as a reviewer, the main thing that we would see is just updates to these values. And that's what we see here is there's just an update to the VS Code version, and then we updated some configuration params, and that was it. So that was pretty run-of-the-mill, nice change. I'm gonna look at one. Let's look at this one. This one touches an interesting package. So there's a link to here to the VS Code extension, an MR from there. And both of these MRs, so this is the Web IDE MR, and then there's a corresponding VS Code extension MR. The reason that these MRs need to come in pairs is because they touched a very special file that lives inside of Web IDE interop. So what in the world is Web IDE interop package? Let's check it out. And that package is README. It contains types and constants shared with external projects, such as the GitLab VS Code extension. So we're kind of declaring, if you want to know about the Web IDE environment, these are the types and constants that you can use to interact in the Web IDE environment. And this is how the VS Code extension implements its polymorphism of we can have a desktop platform and a Web IDE platform that knows how to be somewhat context aware. And so we could spend, a couple of minutes and think of 100 different better ways to do this. But right now, the way that this interop is declared and consumed in the Web IDE and by its clients is we have a file that we just got to keep in sync in the two projects. So whenever this is touched, there's a comment here at the top of we got to change it over elsewhere. So that's why it is come in pairs, because we touched the Web IDE interop here. And so we updated the corresponding file over here. As a reviewer for the Web IDE project, I would just want to be aware of okay, I'm touching this file. I have no idea what this file is about. Let me check out the file. I was like, oh, it says I need to keep it up to date. And so I would ask maybe the reviewer that we keep it up to date, and we're pretty good. Thankfully, this type change is pretty backwards compatible. So there's nothing super breaking here. But along with allowing these request objects to receive headers, they also had to implement the behavior to receive the headers. So that showed up in the client package, which rather than just taking just URL and params, is now also taking headers. And so then here in the VS Code extension project, that those types and the things that reference the types, the contributor just followed the trail, and that's about it. So that's one of the great things about reviewing in this project that both Enrique and I, who frequently contribute this project, feel is because of TypeScript. I do not spend a lot of time having to check for, did I call a thing correctly, kind of bugs that happen in the main project, because it wouldn't even build if you weren't referencing the types correctly. So a lot of the changes start with the type is changing, and then it just trickles from there of, okay, then we got to call it differently. And but sometimes I can get a little out of hand. Not out of hand. What's the word I'm thinking of? It can get a lot. So here's an example of a really large MR. made by me, but I tend to make really large MRs. That's not, I shouldn't do that. But anyways, this was now one of my finer MRs. But Enrique's he's smart enough. He knows how to do it. So when we were talking about, and this history is important, it's kind of important to know about the project too. So this is all just very specific with this MR. Reading the title, we can kind of pull that, okay, there's two classes to be interested in. There's a default and a deprecated. And if you're coming across this in a review and wanted to know more context, this is where, man, just ask a question in the Slack channel. There's a number of people that are familiar with the history here. You could also look at the commit history to kind of get a feel for why are we in this intermediary state where we have a deprecated client. The story behind this specific change is when we were building the Web IDE to be compatible, or we're building the VS Code extension to be compatible with the Web IDE, we had to agree upon an interface that for making requests that the Web IDE can use, because the Web IDE doesn't have to do authentication headers because it can just take advantage of being in the browser's session. Whereas the desktop environment has to uses OAuth tokens and everything. So the way requests are made are just different. And so that's what the default GitLab client is this is how we want to make requests. But previously we kind of had this Wild West GitLab client, very similar to the API module and the JavaScript on the main GitLab project. And we're deprecating it because we want to just use one way of making requests. And so this project was all about making sure, can we do everything the deprecated project client was doing? Can we do it in the new default GitLab client? And it required making a number of like type changes. For instance, here in the Web IDE interop, oh my gosh, this happened last time. Look at this. All right, I'll click on a file. All right, now it works. All right, never mind. But it required making some type changes and some new kind of behavior to the underlying client. And that kind of just, sometimes when those types change, the change just spreads because loads of stuff are referencing the types. Because everything's TypeScript and we have it strict, like you can have a little bit of security that like, okay, at least we're not running into the whole set of bugs that can happen when we're referencing types incorrectly. So making sure that the modules just make sense goes a long way. But this MR was introducing a lot of changes at once. So it's this is probably as big and as gnarly as they might come. Yeah, I wanted to share just some of the recent MRs. I've been talking a little bit, which is a good sign for me to pause. Is there any thoughts or questions or feelings as I blow through some project information?
Yeah, I have a question about, because I saw that you have a bunch of MRs, and basically you need to, as a reviewer, you need to take care of the changes in the packages and versions and everything else. But is there any way to mount this, like to test the MRs locally, and how do you do that?
Yes, great question. Great question. And that's a great segue into the next thing we should probably talk about. So that's one of the great one of the biggest wins we get from this being separated from the main GitLab project is we can run it outside the GDK very easily. And so I'll show how we can do that. We can also run it inside the GDK easily too. And we can dive into that as well. Although it's not usually necessary. But before I dive into demoing that, is there any other kind of questions or thoughts before we jump into actually running the project?
I have a question. So we have different packages within the Web IDE, right? I guess I wanted to ask if do they ever are there any dependencies that, like, for example, package one has this specific dependency. And I guess like, do we have you encountered any problems like updating one and then having to
Yeah,
yeah, I'm
that is a
I'm
good.
trying to, I don't know how to articulate my question, but I think you're getting it.
I do think I understand, and maybe, but I might not. But I think Lodash might be an interesting example of like
Okay, yeah,
you have.
that's a good one.
I need to exclude the extension project. Yeah, you see how because of the what's the word? The monorepo nature of this, we each package can declare its own dependency.
Yeah.
Which could technically be a different runtime version than the other ones that are used. The flip side is, so that's something to just keep an eye on.
Okay.
I don't think we've never run into like runtime issues because of it. It's mainly just like, oh, why is this using a slightly different version than the other one? It's also possible to add like just shared package dependencies and the root level package JSON.
Okay.
Clearly it looks like we don't do that except for like for some dev dependency stuff. But that's a possibility. If we ever find a way, things to improve with this, and if you're like, oh, how come we don't do it this way? That's just so obvious that we should improve things in this way. You're probably right. Like, so there's a lot of opportunities to improve the developer experience here. But yeah, because we do have separate packages, they could reference separate versions of the thing. But the interesting bit is we won't actually likely run into like runtime version conflicts because the way I lost my cool diagram. A lot of the packages create JavaScript bundles themselves. So they're not necessarily like libraries that are consumed as much as like this whole package is creating the entry point to the iframe. And like this whole package is just creating these kind of assets that go here. And so a handful of the packages are more like apps and not necessarily like libraries that get imported, but that issue could come up. That's a good question. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, about the like a follow-up question about the what we were talking about. So for the mono repos, is there any kind of tool that we use for that, or it's more like a pattern? I am not familiar with this kind of architecture, so that's why I'm asking.
Yeah, I honestly I don't find myself thinking about it a lot. But there is here in the documentation, you can see working with packages. And so we have like, here's how to add a new package. So this is using Yarn workspaces, and Yarn 2 has this built-in feature where we can declare what they call workspaces, and we're calling packages.
Oh, that's awesome.
And so it's kind of out of the box, but we have kind of if we are introducing a new package, which like hasn't had to happen, and this is very rare that this has to happen. Here's kind of the steps that like, okay, we want to make sure we have the package JSON. And so it's using TypeScript. We also need to make sure it has a TypeScript JSON for this. And so we just kind of follow these steps, and then we have our new package. How to add like a dependency from a package. So this, we don't have to reference versions inside of the monorepo. We don't reference specific versions. We just say, so if I'm here inside of this package, GitLab Web IDE, and I want to import from Web IDE types, I just say, give me the workspace version. And that's Yarn knows how to resolve this. And it resolves it really nicely, where it actually imports, doesn't mess with symlinks or anything like that. So like this is better than Lerna, which was the the predecessor monorepo tooling, and that could run into, that was a lot more difficult to use than Yarn workspaces. I don't find myself thinking about it. That's
Awesome. Thank you.
that's a good question.
Thank you.
Thanks for asking it. Okay, let's jump into running the project. All right, so I'm here in the project, and maybe I checked out changes and I want to run and test them. So I'm going to run yarn to install the dependencies, and then following the documentation that tells me to start here, it tells me to run this yarn run start example. So I can do yarn run start example. And that is going to run, I have, okay, yeah, it didn't have anything to build because I had run this previously, but if I had not done that, it's going to run yarn run build example, which targets this make file. This is one of the not prettiest parts of the application. It has definitely grown way larger than it was originally intended to be. But this is this helps us in our developer experience, where Make is really good at doing incremental builds, and we can declare what each package is outputting and what are the inputs to that output and what's the recipe for doing all that. So the build runs the make file, and it can do that really well. But when I do start example, it's also keeping watch for changes. So if I make a change, it'll automatically rebuild. So I can, as I'm contributing or if I'm testing something out, I can see that. But it serves everything up in this URL, which I'm going to open in Chrome, because we don't have cache breaking in the assets that get served up yet. So you want to make sure that you open your dev console and have disabled cache so that you don't get the previous builds assets when you're testing stuff out. And there's kind of a bug with Firefox and the way VS Code works, because VS Code depends a lot on web workers and service workers, and those kind of do some caching on inside of the requests that are made there. And when I do disable cache in Firefox, it does not disable the cache of some things that get served up from these web workers and service workers. So I've noticed Firefox not being super reliable, and that's definitely something we need to improve with our developer experience. But I started the example project, and this looks nothing like we've seen so far, and it's a very wonky, weird form. And this is all coming from this example package. So example gets imported by nothing. This is a Vue app, which loads the GitLab Web IDE and but provides us some configuration parameters that normally get injected from the main GitLab application. So I could provide whatever GitLab URL I want to connect to, whatever project path, whatever other ref, and there's some other options here. One most notably that I can provide a GitLab token if I want to from the example app, be able to like make changes. This doesn't ever have to happen in the main app because we can just take advantage of having the user's session cookie to authenticate with. But when you're in a totally separate app, we got to somehow authenticate. And so we'll keep track of it with the token. I've included, this is mostly me just saying like, hey, this is an example app. If you want to put a production token, that's on you. That's me trying to make sure people think twice before doing that. But it should be fine if you wanted to. But I'm not going to. So I can run this without a token. And it's going to, on the ref for the Web IDE project is main. So I'm gonna run this without a token. And I was playing this before, so it was doing stuff. These errors are expected right now because of something else that I was testing. It's gonna, you saw a little modal pop up, which I instinctively close, but it just opens everything in a read only when it detects that you're not authenticated. So I can still test some things out in this way. And I can just do like some smoke testing in this way, which we'll do often. And in fact, because this example app actually gets produced in our pipelines. So I'll even from time to time, the artifact is gone. It was removed 3 days ago. Let's go to a different one. Let's go to yeah, let's look at this one that Enrique's doing. Maybe this one will do it. Hopefully it's building. Yeah, this one builds. So let's check this out. I don't know what Enrique's doing, but we'll see. So I can browse the build jobs artifacts and jump into example dist index HTML and then jump into it. And now I can run the example app from the MR. So without even checking out locally. So I'll do this a lot too. And since this does include, some cache breaking thing, I don't necessarily need to worry about whether I'm in Firefox or Chrome, whatever, something like that. But yeah, I can test things out without even checking out locally from this example app, which is really cool. So we could test merge requests out this way. Does that kind of answer how we could test things out?
Definitely. Yeah, that's
Cool.
great.
There's one other really cool way to test things out, but wait, there's more. There's this manual job. Enrique's gonna be like, "What are you doing to my MR?" There's this manual job of where you can create a development package. Oh wait, this is the other MR that was already merged. We're going back to Enrique's MR. There's this manual job where we can create a development package that all right, when this runs, it basically gives me, I can get a URL that I can include in my I can update on my local GDK's GitLab Web IDE to, instead of pointing to this NPM version, I can have it point to that tarball that gets produced from the job artifact. And so this way I can test just in my local GDK, what would this new Web IDE version look like? And that's another way that I'll often do testing, because sometimes we're making a change. I'm like, I really want to make sure this works all in integration. So we'll do things that way. Yeah, that's another way to test it out. Yeah, we've got just a little bit of time left. I'm gonna pause in case there's any other pressing questions, and then I have probably one more random thing to kind of jump into.
What's the client only versus remote development?
Oh man, that's a good question.
Example.
That's a really good question. So that's this is some history to the one of the reasons all this got released really, really quickly was our remote development offering was an alpha POC version of it got coupled to the Web IDE environment. Because I guess the way that we kicked it off that you could connect to a remote connection was with this button here that was produced in the Web IDE. So a user could click this and enter some sort of remote development environment, and then they'd have a whole integrated working terminal browser editing environment provided by GitLab, which is really cool. But this is actually not the current state of the remote development at all. We have our own workspaces that you probably saw advertised. Maybe that's not the right word, but it kind of seems like it's advertised. You kind of see it advertised here. So this is actually the way the remote development environment works now. Not through this way, which means we might actually probably be able to get rid of this button. Something probably have to check on. And which means we probably can get rid of all of this setup as well, too. But all of that is like here we would, where the user was expected to put in these parameters, okay, we can test that out through our example app in this way. So we had two different kind of entry, the way that the Web IDE could start. One is hooking into a remote development environment where the terminal actually works, so you can run commands and stuff like that, which is kind of neat and interesting. But the current workspace is an actually thought out implementation of the kind of experience users would expect rather than having to manually enter this thing. So long story short, it seems like it's maybe some legacy kind of feature stuff that we might actually need to get rid of. Don't quote me on that. I probably should talk to our product manager.
Oh, that's enough that I just don't have to worry about it. Keep it on client only.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. Yeah, that's a good question. Any other questions? Okay. So I want to share. There's just 2 minutes left. I want to just familiarize ourselves with one more. Other than I want to highlight, there's so many things we want to improve here. So like as a reviewer, don't ever feel like if you see something that's pre-existing, like, oh, I guess this is the way we wanted it to be. If like that's we want as many eyes that have a knack for maintainability and what makes sense to be looking at it and giving thoughtful comments and suggestions is going to be helpful. So but the one thing I think I wanted to highlight is one of the ways that the way that we've implemented the Web IDE to seamlessly integrate with the GitLab authentication and not have to pass tokens around or anything like that is through this weird package called mediator commands. And going back to our architecture diagram. So the VS Code Bootstrap, it imports mediator commands, and then the extension also imports mediator commands. So these are special commands that get executed outside of the extension sandbox. VS Code runs every extension in a very tailored sandbox for security reasons, so that when you download extensions from the extension marketplace, it can't really make a muck of things. Which is great, but it's not great when we want to piggyback off of the user's cookie to make authenticated requests. So the current architecture for implementing the seamless GitLab Web IDE experience is we have a set of commands that when we need to make API requests, they go through these mediator commands. And so we have, and that's also how the VS Code extension project, the GitLab VS Code extension project, it looks for those mediator commands. So this weird package declares a whole bunch of commands, and commands is like a VS Code specific thing that you can just run based off of the title of the command. But we have in the Web IDE interop, you will have these mediator commands that we declare fetch from API. So anytime we need to make an API request, we call that mediator command. And because it's running outside of the extension sandbox, it automatically picks up the user session context. So that's one of the magic sauce of how the Web IDE works, is this weird mediator commands package. But then, man, that was about, that's kind of it. So we're going to spend the next bit of time actually pairing on something so we can feel what it's like to make a change through all of it. And then we'll go from there. So yeah, thanks for listening and participating. I'm still here. So if you want to talk some more or ask questions about it, I'm still here, but we can call it. Or
Thank you for the deep dive. It was awesome. It's very interesting. So I hope to learn more about TypeScript these days.
Yeah, don't let I hope that TypeScript is very intuitive to pick up if you're familiar at all with any kind of typed language. And so don't let that stop you. I think I'm really excited to get more eyes onto the project. So I really appreciate all of your interest. I'm looking forward to next time where we actually start pairing on something.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. I'll catch you all later. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Cool.
Bye-bye.
Bye.